A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek refuge in Allah from Satan the accursed. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and you are welcome to the Shari'ah Intelligence course. I am your host, Muhammad Nurudeen Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topics are Brother Nasir Bello and Sister Salatu Sule. You are both most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Today we'll be looking at USUL AL-FIQH, the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, the field of Islamic legal theory, the subject that scholars studied to better represent the Prophet in his absence, to come up with a consistent methodology of representing the Islamic position on new issues that were not handled explicitly in the Qur'an, in the Sunnah. So the first question I'd like to ask, what is USUL AL-FIQH? We've all heard about fiqh before, law or jurisprudence. What is USUL AL-FIQH and how is it different from fiqh? Brother Nasir.
Basically, USUL AL-FIQH is about the root or foundation, the evidence, and fiqh is actually the outcome or the product of this process of process of exercise of ijtihad. Now there are a number of metaphors that scholars use in trying to explain this concept and how they relate or differ with one another. Some use the tree as a metaphor where they look at usul as constituting the root, and of course the root or the foundation, while the shoot and the fruit that comes out of the nutrients that was absorbed by the root as the fiqh or the product of the tree. Others use manufacturing industry as a metaphor to explain that the raw materials and the method used in production as usul al-fiqh and the product manufactured in the industry as fiqh. Others equally use research methodology as a metaphor to explain these two very important concepts, where they will talk about the principles used and the methodology of analysis as usul al-fiqh, and the conclusions or the findings arrived at as fiqh. So essentially the study of proofs, what they call adilla, or the use of evidence, is what we call usul al-fiqh, while the study of rulings and verdict is what we call fiqh. In the case of rulings, how to pray, for example, how to fast, how to do hajj, this is the domain of fiqh. When you begin to ask about how these rulings are arrived at, what are the evidence that lead to that conclusion or that verdict, this is equally the domain of usul al-fiqh. Allahu alam.
So as you said, usul means the roots of usul al-fiqh, the roots of fiqh. So if we use that metaphor, fiqh would be the shooting system, as you said, what's above ground, the branches and the fruit. Whereas usul al-fiqh is the study of the rooting system, the sources of the laws. Sister Salatu, could you elaborate, add?
When we talk about usul al-fiqh, as Brother Nasir mentioned, we are looking at the root sources, the evidence. And when we say fiqh, we mean the result, the outcome. When you follow those or you apply those evidences or you use those tools. It's similar to the difference between an equation and the result. Once you've carried out the mathematical operations that the equation requires, or the difference between board mass and the result you get at the end of the day. Usul al-fiqh, looking at root sources of rulings, is looking at a number of sources. In a way, you could say a toolbox or a menu of available sources of evidence. What you get at the end of the day depends on which of these sources of evidence do you refer to, do you bring into play as a scholar in mujtahid, and in what order. So it's not just the root sources of evidence, but the ranking. How do you order them? How do you triangulate them? It's also similar to what happens when somebody says, I'm going to cook a dish, and the person has ingredients in front of him or her. Let's say someone has beef and oil and water and spices. the person might choose to first marinate the meat, then fry, then boil then fry, or the person might actually choose to make more of a soup. At the end of the day, you'll get, it's a meat dish, but it will be different depending on how did you order them. Similarly, so if someone chooses to say, okay, here is the evidence I'm going to use, and I'm also going to depend on that one and look at that one, it would lead to one result different from when a scholar chooses other forms. This is actually the relationship and the difference between usul al-fiqh and fiqh.
If I use my language, fiqh sounds like the law. Usul al-fiqh is the study of the production of the law, the crafting of the law. That's usul al-fiqh. But what's the final outcome, as you put it, the final product of the factory? If usul al-fiqh is the factory, fiqh is the product of the factory. If usul al-fiqh is how you cook, the final dish is fiqh.
Yeah.
If, as you said, usul al-fiqh is the equation, fiqh is the result of that equation. Another area I'd like us to look at, many of us have also heard of the term ijtihad.
Yeah.
What is ijtihad, and how is ijtihad different from usul al-fiqh?
Okay. Ijtihad is that exercise that the scholars competent in that area, that they undertake when there is an issue that needs an answer, a problem looking for a solution, a ruling needs to be made, and they look in the Qur'an, they look in the Sunnah, and they cannot find a categorical statement or provision that answers that question. There's nothing explicit, or there's even silence with regard to this issue that is in front of the scholar. The person who undertakes ijtihad, who's qualified to do so, is called a mujtahid. It's that level of jurisprudential reasoning and thinking, using the available evidence. It kicks in when, as I mentioned earlier, the text, that is the Quran and the Sunnah, are silent on an issue, or the provisions available are ambiguous, they are open to several interpretations, presumptions have to be made. So reasoning comes into play here. Now, when it comes to ijtihad, what it does really is help scholars reconcile revelation, which we say is fixed, it's unchanging, and reality, which is fluid and changing. When the Prophet ﷺ was alive, he would receive revelation, he would share that, he would exemplify how do you apply this revelation. When he died, that stopped. And that is why we say revelation is fixed. What has been said, what has been revealed, has already been said and revealed. Human existence continues and our interactions continue, and we discover more things, we encounter new situations. These things need to be reconciled with the text. This is where ijtihad comes in. The role of usul al-fiqh is to regulate ijtihad. There is the presumption that anybody who is going to undertake ijtihad, once you say someone is a mujtahid, there's a presumption right there in that title that this mujtahid is versed in usul al-fiqh, because usul al-fiqh, being the menu of evidences as well as the methodology of ranking them, regulates ijtihad. So that a person doesn't, let me use the example of cooking again. You walk into the kitchen, you say there's meat, there's pepper, there's curry, there's this, there's water, and then you just toss them all into the pot. You'll have an edible meal, but that's so different from the person who walks in and knows what's the import of marinating. What role would it play if I leave the onions to sit with the meat for this length of time? What role would it play if I boil first and then I fry the meat? So the mujtahid is the person who understands how these things work together, just as you have the BODMAS that helps. If I say to someone 2 + 3 × 4, the person can just carry out the mathematical operations the way it's been presented and will say 2 + 3, well, that's 5. 5 × 4, that's 20. It's an answer. But the expert will say that's not the correct answer. You should have gone by way of BODMAS. You should have done your multiplication first and then you do your addition, by which way you'll get a different answer. So there's BODMAS to regulate mathematical operations. We have different fields where we have such regulations. So the job of usul al-fiqh relative to ijtihad is to regulate how ijtihad is done, so that people don't just wake up in the morning and say, well, I think the Qur'an is silent, Sunnah is silent, so you know what, I think this is the ruling. It's meant to regulate and make sure that there's consistency in what jurists come up with, that there is preservation of the spirit of the text, that in as much as we say the text is silent, or there is a degree of presumption that comes into play when we are saying we think this is the best answer, or jurists are saying, that we are still as faithful as possible to the text itself. We'll have to keep emphasizing the fact that once you say ijtihad is coming into play, reasoning is being used, the jurist is using his reason. It's not his reason in a vacuum. It's his reason anchored in the Quran and the Sunnah. If you don't have even specific provisions, you do have general provisions that still help say, here is the direction in which you should be heading.
Thank you so much. Brother Nasir, what would you add?
Well, ijtihad basically is that effort that is being exerted in the processes of finding solution, while USUL AL-FIQH is that established methodology that guide the process of coming up or producing a good solution. Now, it's just like driving and a good driving, cooking, and of course, cooking a good meal. It reminds me of an incident that happens back in the university. In our room, we used to pair ourselves when it comes to cooking, where the one who knows how to cook will be paired with the other who doesn't know how to cook. And therefore, the responsibility of the one who doesn't know how to cook is to fetch water, wash plates, wash the pot, and make sure everything is ready. While the guy who knows how to cook will be the one that will cook and make available the meal. So one day, my friend, who happens to be the one who knows how to cook, was having lectures. So after I have discharged my own responsibility, he pleaded with me that, look, what you should do, he put on everything together, the ingredient, the rice, and said, when the rice absorbed the water, then drop it down. That means it's ready. And I said, okay. The following day, I called for a meeting in the room, and I said there is a need for us to rearrange this formula, because I equally now know how to cook. So I shouldn't be given that, difficult responsibility of fetching water, washing, and all that. So the thing is, what I realize is cooking is not difficult, but reflecting the incident and how it relates to this issue of ijtihad and USUL AL-FIQH, I think what he did was actually an ijtihad that is not based on an established methodology. Probably if you ask an expert on how these things are done, there are arrangements, there are ways of putting what and at what time, which has not been followed. And that is why initially, before the experience, I thought it was a really difficult task. It's a meticulous process. So I took the pain and the burden of doing all these difficult things. But when I realized it could be done without necessarily following the formula, I said, okay, I also mastered how to do it. So basically, that differentiate ijtihad and USUL AL-FIQH. It's about getting a solution and getting a good solution. It's about driving and driving good. It's about cooking and cooking good. And real ijtihad definitely requires a competent mujtahid. It requires the use of USUL AL-FIQH, it requires the use of maqasid al-sharia, and it's indeed required the use of qawaid al-fiqhiyya and a very good understanding of the reality and the context. Until you are able to put all this together, you cannot arrive at good ijtihad, or what we call real ijtihad. Allah knows best.
Thank you very much. I like that metaphor of the just cooking in any way, and the difference between that and a professional cook or a chef doing it in a better way, and what would be ideal, and how using USUL AL-FIQH is what makes ijtihad juristic reasoning, not just any kind of reasoning. Ijtihad guided by USUL AL-FIQH is what makes it represent the Prophet best in his absence. It is what allows us to think in a way that is mimicking the methodology that the Sahaba used in the absence of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The other question I'd like to ask Brother Nasir, Now we're talking about the role of reasoning. If we could move to looking at sound reasoning, just good common sense reasoning, sound reasoning. What is the role of reasoning when it comes to the major Islamic sciences? So ijtihad guided by usul gives us juristic reasoning. That's the real ijtihad. What other roles does reasoning play when it comes to other fields?
Well, in the field of biology, there is this concept of symbiosis relationship. And if you look at the history of Islamic tradition, that has always been the nature of relationship between sound reasoning and revelation. In Islamic tradition, lots of fields that have significant benefit and add a lot of value in the promotion and protection and of course expanding the frontiers of knowledge and understanding in Islamic tradition resulted in the utilization of the agency of reasoning in its, in the way it relates with the revelation or the text. Take for example the field that deals with verification and establishing authenticity of the text. That has been one of the critical subjects that establish authenticity, and this actually employs the agency of human reasoning in trying to develop that field. And these are fields that are today considered to be the field of jarh wa ta'adil, for example, the field of mustalah al-hadith, what they call the tabhis al-ilal, that is used by the scholars of hadith, by the scholars of the Qur'an to understand and to establish authority of the text, be it the Qur'an, be it the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So also if you look at the field that deals with understanding meanings and implication of the text, this is also talking about the field of tafsir, the field of hadith commentary. You would also find a lot of utilization of agency of sound reasoning that goes into trying to bring out the wisdom, the meaning, and the implication of the text. There are many others, other fields that were developed over time by scholars in the Islamic tradition in the way reason helps immeasurably in trying to promote, expand the knowledge and understanding of Islam and Sharia as a whole.
This is interesting. So you've touched on the authenticity of texts like hadith and Qur'an, that it is reason that is used to establish this, the meaning of the language of the text, but also you have talked about the implications or the wisdom behind the text. Salah, what would you add to this?
I'd like to add the fact that it's reason that helps people know how to apply revelation to reality, how to apply text to context. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the revelation is there, it's already fixed, it's done. So you might have a particular verse of the Quran or a particular hadith that you know it applies to this context, or it applies to this situation. Now, it's reason that helps you understand that, yes, it applies to this situation in this context, but not in that context. Or it applies to this context, this set of circumstances, but it doesn't apply to that other set of circumstances, even if they look similar or the same. It's reason that makes that discernment. And as we mentioned in previous episodes, the reason in itself is the gift that Allah has given us. And He expects us to use that gift. Revelation has stopped, but the ability to reason has not stopped. Another role that reason plays with regard to the Islamic sciences is when it comes to the defense of Islamic teachings and ideas. You have misconceptions that arise from people not actually knowing the truth or misunderstanding something. You also have misrepresentation that's more deliberate, sometimes from within Islam itself, sometimes from outside Islam. It's reason that helps people know how best do you address and tackle these. Because when it comes to explaining an idea, explaining a concept, clearing a misconception, exposing a misrepresentation, it requires the artful use of language that is dependent on reason. You might have 2 or 3 people who are equally knowledgeable with regards to the text, but you might find someone has sharpened that skill to use language to explain, to make sense of the words, so that the person who has misunderstood something can get a clearer understanding. For example, Brother Nasir mentioned how it's reason that has been used to develop the field of authentication of the text. So if someone stands up today and says God doesn't exist, I don't believe he does. If you go just by your knowledge of the text, you will present him with the Qur'an or her, and you would say, but he does. He says he does. Where does he say it? In this book. The person says, so how are you sure that's God speaking? I don't see God here. I don't hear his voice. You therefore have to now go to the level of logic and reasoning and what we would call beautiful argument to help the person understand, because the source you are presenting the text is the thing the person is saying. I don't regard that as useful. This, I think, is also one of the challenges we've had in more recent times, where young people, even Muslims, lose the belief that God exists. And when they go to some scholars to say, I'm having this doubt about the existence of God or the strength of this book you call the Qur'an, the scholar just quotes more text. The role of reason is to say, understand when the text in itself is the thing the person is pushing away or has misunderstood. So reason helps you know what do I bring in, or how do I combine the different evidences, not just the Qur'an and the Sunnah, but the other available evidences, that menu we mentioned earlier. What else should I bring in to help the person understand or see the full picture?
Wonderful. I think you've summarized a lot, added points to what Brother Nasir mentioned, that reasoning has a role in the fields of Islamic sciences. I think you added this subject of the appropriateness of rulings to particular contexts, and that will probably be one major area that we will be looking at in the field of Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah. You've also touched on the defense of faith, or what some call ilm al-Tawheed or ilm al-Kalam, this subject there where beliefs are being defended through logical arguments. And in fact, one would even say you have Islamic philosophy that has guided scholars on many topics to ensure they are loyal to the Quran and Sunnah. And even when a scholar got lost in their use of reasoning, other scholars guided them back and corrected them using more sound reasoning, stronger arguments. In other words, reason is actually what is also used to guide poor reasoning. I would like us to look, Salatu, at the other Islamic sciences. What is unique about USUL al-FIQH, and how is it different from some of these other fields within the Islamic sciences?
The uniqueness of USUL al-FIQH is similar to what I mentioned earlier. It's the regulator. It's the regulator of evidences. That's one unique factor. The scholar who is well versed in USUL al-FIQH, the Usuli scholar, is the person who would also engage with the muhaddith, the scholar of hadith, who would engage with the content that the mufassir brings up, the scholar of the Quran. For the muhaddith, they would usually stop at, here is the hadith, and they will go into the authenticity and its classification, and the mufassir would talk about the verses of the Quran, when was it revealed, the context, and all of that. The Usuli scholar looks at these sources, what is their relationship, looks at all the other sources, and how do they all connect, and what would be the implication if you were to use these sources in maybe one order or the other. I think it was Professor Muhammad Hashim Kamali who actually mentioned that after the Quran and Sunnah, when you say you want to go into ijtihad, you're talking about that's the next strong source of Islamic law. And as we said, you can't talk about ijtihad, real ijtihad, as Brother Nasir put it, without reference to USUL al-FIQH.
Thank you. Nasir, what would you add to that?
Well, I think over time in the history of Islamic tradition, many fields were developed. With the exception of the fiqh, you cannot directly connect them to USUL al-FIQH, but of course they have contributed, or mastering them add to the quality of the processes of ijtihad or the work of the Usuli scholars. If you look at the field of fiqh, of course, USUL al-FIQH is very much tied to or related to the subject of fiqh, because it helps in guiding the processes of producing what we call Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic law, which is the fiqh. Apart from that, the field of Islamic or Hadith sciences today, which is looking at establishing the process of establishing or authenticating Hadith, is quite independent or not so directly related with the field of Usul al-Fiqh. Or you look at the field of tafsir, Quranic commentary today, and how it is restricted to understanding the meaning of the verses of the Qur'an. And you have specialist people that have specialized in this field, not in any way being qualified or considered to be mujtahidun or the expert in usul, because their understanding or their expertise is restricted to one area, one critical ingredient that works in the process of training or developing an expert that is called an usuli scholar or mujtahid or a mufti. So also if you look at the field of history, Islamic history, it's also not in any way related or directly related to the field of Usul al-Fiqh or the field of Qira'at or what we call recitation of the Qur'an. But again, as I said at the beginning, these are essential fields of knowledge that mastering them and understanding them will add significantly to the quality of the process of ijtihad and will distinguish the mujtahid in his process of coming up or crafting fatwa.
This is interesting. So if one looks at it probably from another side, just to use the metaphor of the healthcare system, one would describe ijtihad as the specialization of the mujtahid, the way one would say an industrial pharmacist is specialized in manufacturing new medication, new medicines. And while the mujtahid does depend on the authentic hadith and clear understanding of verses of the Qur'an and all those supporting fields, similarly, the industrial pharmacist does depend on the botanist, he does depend on the zoologist and the microbiologist and the mineralogist and these other fields. However, what is unique is that one is concerned about producing new medication for new situations, whereas the others are not. While they contribute, that's not their role. And so the field of Usul al-Fiqh, as you're both explaining, is what regulates ijtihad, what links reasoning to the Qur'an, Sunnah, and the methodology of the Qur'an, of the Sunnah, and practiced by the Sahaba. And so while everybody is important, those responsible for issuing fatwas, for ijtihad, are those who are experts in the field of usul. And as we will see in our subsequent episodes, other subjects related to usul, such as qawaid al-fiqhiyya, maqasid sharia. I'd like to thank you both for your time and contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah, next time we come, we will carry on looking at the evolution of Usul al-Fiqh. How did it start and what has it become? May Allah take us to that time. Thank you very much. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.